Ethan Carter stood in the middle of a vast, open chamber, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the cold stone floor beneath his boots, the air thick with the scent of strange, unrecognizable flowers. The towering walls around him were covered in glowing symbols, pulsating gently as if alive. He was surrounded by an alien world, one that was unlike anything he had ever seen. His mind raced as he tried to calm himself, knowing that the trial before him was his only chance to avoid an unimaginable fate. The jury court was like no courtroom Ethan had ever imagined. The entire room was circular, and in the center was a large, raised platform where he now stood. The air shimmered with a strange energy, and above him, seated on high platforms, were the members of the court. These were the leaders of the Juran species, a race of aliens that had conquered vast stretches of space. But what caught Ethan's attention most were the judges themselves. They were all women, tall and regal, their eyes glowing with intelligence and power. Their bodies radiated an aura of authority that made even the bravest of beings feel small. Ethan wasn't exactly sure what he had done wrong. He had been an ambassador, sent to learn about Juran culture and establish diplomatic ties between Earth and their people. But things had quickly gone awry. He had misunderstood a cultural tradition, one that was of utmost importance to the Juran, and that had led to this moment. A woman with silver-blue skin and eyes, like the stars, stood at the front of the court. She was the head judge, a woman called Loritha, and her gaze was cold as it fell upon Ethan. He had heard whispers of her before. Loritha was known for her strictness and her unforgiving nature. "You stand accused, human, of dishonoring our sacred customs," she said in a voice that echoed through the chamber, strong and clear. "The disrespect you have shown our people cannot go unpunished. You have violated our rituals, our trust, and the very foundation of Juran society." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his mouth. How could he explain that he hadn't meant to offend anyone? How could he explain that he was just trying to learn? "I was unaware of the significance of the ceremony," Ethan finally managed to say, his voice shaky. "I had no intention of disrespecting your people. I was only trying to understand your culture better." Loritha's eyes narrowed, and she glanced to the other judges, who sat silently, watching Ethan with sharp, unreadable expressions. Their presence made him feel even smaller. It was like being under the gaze of gods, their judgment swift and final. "You claim ignorance," Loritha said slowly, "but ignorance is no excuse in Juran law. You have violated the sacred meeting ritual, a tradition that has been in place for millennia. This ritual is not simply a custom, it is the heart of our society. To misunderstand it is to disrespect the very essence of who we are." Ethan's mind raced. He had read about the meeting ritual during his preparations. It was a tradition where the Juran women and members of other species were meant to form a deep emotional connection, an exchange of thoughts, feelings, and energy. It was a bond that would last forever. But he hadn't realized it was such a serious matter. He had thought it was more of a formal greeting, not something that could cause such a huge rift. "Please," he said, taking a step forward. "I didn't mean to break any laws. I simply misunderstood the customs. I am here to learn, to make peace, not to bring harm." Loritha's gaze softened for a brief moment, but then she raised a hand, signaling for silence. The chamber grew still. "Your ignorance cannot be ignored," she said. "And yet, we see something else in you. Despite your mistake, you are here, standing before us, seeking understanding. This we do not often see in outsiders. Therefore, we will offer you a chance to redeem yourself and show that you are worthy of the Juran's trust." Ethan's hope flared. Maybe there was still a way out of this. "Your punishment," Loritha continued, her voice now sharp again, "is not death, nor exile. It is a test, a ritual. You will participate in the meeting ritual alongside the Juran females. You will experience what it means to truly understand our culture. And through this experience, we will judge whether you are worthy to remain in our world." Ethan's stomach churned. The meeting ritual. He had read about it, but he didn't fully understand it. It was said to be an intense, emotional experience where individuals formed deep, almost mystical connections. It was meant to foster trust, but it was also said to be difficult, often overwhelming. "And what if I fail?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "If you fail," Loritha replied, her voice chilling, "you will leave here with nothing. You will be cast out, your name forgotten, your mission a failure. But if you succeed, you will gain a new understanding, and your place among the Jurin will be secured. This is your opportunity to prove your worth. The choice is yours." Ethan felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. There was no going back. If he wanted to survive this trial and prove himself, he would have to participate in something beyond anything he had ever imagined. And the fate of his mission, and his life, rested on it. Loritha's eyes softened once more, but only briefly. "You will begin tomorrow," she said. "Prepare yourself." As Ethan was led from the chamber, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, would he be able to survive the meeting ritual? Ethan stepped out of the trial chamber, his mind still reeling from the shocking punishment that awaited him. The Jurin court, with its cold, unyielding presence, had left him with little hope for escape. The meeting ritual was now his only chance to avoid being cast aside, lost to the annals of history. He had no idea what the ritual truly meant, but he had no choice but to face it. As he was escorted through the labyrinth of corridors, Ethan couldn't help but notice the alien world outside. The walls of the building were smooth and transparent, offering a view of a vast alien city that stretched as far as the eye could see. The buildings seemed to grow out of the ground itself, twisting in strange, organic shapes. Some were towering spires that reached up to the sky, while others were round, like giant, glowing mushrooms. Everywhere he looked, there was something different, something unfamiliar. The sky above was not the blue of Earth. It was a deep violet, dotted with shimmering stars that seemed much closer than those he had seen back home. In the distance, Ethan could see strange flying creatures, their wings beating silently as they glided between the tall structures. The city itself was alive, as though it had a heartbeat of its own, pulsing with energy that Ethan couldn't quite understand. He was led to a large transport vehicle, more like a floating platform than a traditional spacecraft. It hovered just above the ground, moving smoothly and silently as if it were part of the air itself. Ethan stepped aboard, and the platform immediately began to move, lifting them high above the ground and gliding toward what appeared to be the heart of the city. As they traveled, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the sheer scale of the Jurin world. It was beautiful in a way that was impossible to describe, a blend of nature and technology working in perfect harmony. The air smelled different here, rich, with an undertone of something both sweet and spicy. He felt out of place in this strange world, like a foreign element in an alien system, but he had no time for awe. He needed to prepare himself for what was to come. The platform slowly descended into a large plaza, where several figures were waiting. They were all women, like the judges from the court, and they exuded the same sense of power and authority. Their skin was smooth and glowing, and their eyes seemed to pierce through Ethan, as though they could see every thought in his mind. They wore flowing robes of intricate patterns, their movements graceful and fluid, as though they were one with their surroundings. One of the women stepped forward. She was taller than the others, with dark, almost metallic skin that shimmered in the light. Her eyes were a piercing shade of violet, and her long hair flowed like a river of liquid silver. Ethan recognized her immediately as Clyra, the matriarch he had heard about in the court. She was one of the most powerful women among the Jurin, a leader in her society who commanded respect from everyone around her. "You are the human," Clyra said, her voice deep and commanding, "the one who has been chosen to participate in the meeting ritual." Ethan nodded, trying to steady his breath. His heart was racing, and he could feel the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. This was the moment that would determine everything. I didn't mean to offend your people, Ethan said, struggling to find the right words. I just didn't understand the significance of your customs. Clyra studied him for a long moment, her violet eyes never leaving his face. You will soon understand, she said. The meeting ritual is not a simple matter of customs. It is the foundation of our society. It binds us, connects us, and shapes us in ways that outsiders cannot comprehend. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling both nervous and intrigued. What had he gotten himself into? The idea of connecting with someone on such a deep level, especially someone from an entirely different species, was overwhelming. But he had no choice now. He had to see this through. Clyra gestured for him to follow her, and he did so, trying to keep his composure. They walked through a series of chambers that were far more beautiful than any building he had seen before. The walls were made of smooth, translucent material that shimmered with a soft, ethereal glow. Strange plants grew in the corners, their leaves changing colors as they moved in time with the rhythm of the air. The entire place felt alive, as though it was breathing, reacting to their presence. Finally, they arrived at a large, circular room. The floor was covered in soft, glowing mats that seemed to pulse with a gentle energy. In the center of the room stood a large pedestal, its surface etched with intricate symbols that Ethan couldn't read. Surrounding the pedestal were more women, all standing in a circle, their eyes fixed on him. This is where the meeting ritual will take place, Clyra explained. You will stand in the center, and we will connect with you. Through this connection, you will learn about us, and we will learn about you. It will be an exchange of thoughts, emotions, and memories. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. He had read about the ritual, of course, but reading about it was nothing like experiencing it. He had no idea what to expect, only that it was not going to be easy. What do I have to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nothing, Clyra replied. Simply allow yourself to be open. Let us in and trust that the experience will be enlightening. The other women in the circle stepped forward, their eyes glowing with a soft, otherworldly light. Ethan felt an almost magnetic pull toward them, as though their presence was drawing him in. He stood in the center of the room, unsure of what to do, but trusting that he had no other option. Suddenly, the air seemed to hum with energy. The symbols on the pedestal began to glow, and the women's eyes brightened even further. Ethan's heart raced as he felt an odd warmth wash over him, starting from his chest and spreading throughout his body. It was as though he was no longer alone in his own mind, as if someone, was reaching out to him. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and braced himself. This was the moment. There was no turning back now. Ethan's body felt tense as the women surrounded him, their presence now overwhelming. The soft hum of energy in the room seemed to grow louder, and he could feel it vibrating through his bones. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The air had become thick, charged with an electricity that made every inch of his skin tingle. As the Jurin women's eyes glowed brighter, he realized that this was more than just a ceremony. This was something much deeper, something that would change him forever. Clyra, the tallest of the women, stepped forward. She had been the one to lead him to this place, and now it was her voice that he would hear next. This is the meeting ritual, human, she said, her voice both calm and powerful. It is a bond, a connection. Through it, we will learn from one another. We will share what we are and what we have known for thousands of years. But the true test lies in your willingness to open yourself. Ethan felt his throat go dry. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he now understood that this was not just a matter of respecting their customs. The ritual was about more than tradition. It was about sharing the deepest parts of themselves. The thought of it was almost overwhelming. What do you mean by share? Ethan asked, his voice shaky. Clyra looked at him with a knowing expression. We will connect, human. Our minds will reach into yours, and your mind will reach into ours. We will share our thoughts, our emotions, and our experiences. You will come to know us as we have never known you. And in turn, we will learn from you. You are our guest, and we welcome you into our world." Ethan swallowed hard. He had never experienced anything like this before. On Earth, humans often relied on words to communicate, but the Jiren didn't seem to need words at all. The way they spoke of connection, of sharing, made it sound as if language itself was secondary. He wondered if he was even prepared for what was to come. He wasn't sure he was ready to let strangers, let alone alien women, into his thoughts, let alone share his most private memories. Before he could say anything, the women began to circle around him, their movements slow and deliberate. As they moved, a soft, almost melodic hum filled the air. The glow of their eyes grew stronger, and the symbols on the pedestal began to glow brighter. Ethan felt his breath quicken. He had never felt so exposed. One of the women, an older Jiren, her skin darker than the others, with streaks of silver running through her hair, extended her hand toward Ethan. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, Ethan felt a strange pull. It wasn't a physical force, but a mental one. It was as if her thoughts were calling to him, reaching across the gap between them. Tentatively, Ethan reached out and took her hand. The instant their skin made contact, he felt something stir inside him, a rush of warmth, followed by an intense sense of clarity. It was as if his mind was suddenly wide open, and he could feel the world around him with a depth he had never known before. The thoughts of the Jiren woman, her hopes, fears, and experiences, flowed into him like a river of memories and emotions. For a moment, he was overwhelmed. He could see the world through her eyes, feel the weight of her past, the struggle she had gone through to become the leader she was today. He felt her strength, her wisdom, but also her loneliness. It was an experience unlike any other, and it left him breathless. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the connection faded. Ethan blinked, trying to clear the strange, vivid images from his mind. The woman's hand was still in his, but the overwhelming flood of emotions and memories had stopped. "You have begun to understand." Clara's voice rang out, her tone soft yet commanding. "This is only the beginning, human. There is much more you will feel, much more you will know. Are you prepared for this?" Ethan nodded, though his mind was still racing. He hadn't expected the ritual to be like this. Not so intense, not so personal. But there was no turning back now. He had to see it through. I'll do my best," he said, though his voice wavered. Clara gave him a faint smile, her violet eyes glowing with something almost compassionate. "Good. Now, let us continue." The women moved closer, each one taking their turn to step forward. As they did, the bond between Ethan and the Jiren grew stronger. Each woman shared her thoughts and experiences with him, and with each connection, Ethan felt as though he was being pulled deeper into their world. It was as if their lives had been laid out before him, and he was seeing them in ways he never could have imagined. Some of the memories were joyful, full of celebration and triumph. Others were filled with pain, struggles, and loss. But through it all, Ethan began to understand something he hadn't before. The Jiren were not just a powerful, ancient race. They were a people who had lived through countless challenges, their society shaped by centuries of conflict and growth. They were strong not because of their physical power, but because of their ability to adapt, to learn from the past, and to connect with each other. As the ritual continued, Ethan began to feel the pull of their collective consciousness. It wasn't just their memories that were shared. It was their emotions, their very essence. He could feel their fears and hopes mingling with his own. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel alone in the universe. He wasn't just a human ambassador on a foreign planet anymore. He was part of something much larger, something much more powerful. But just as he thought he was beginning to understand, the connection became too much. His mind started to feel crowded, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the Jiren experiences that were flowing into him. He fought to stay grounded, to keep control over his thoughts, but it was becoming harder with every passing second. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The ritual was intense, but it wasn't just about sharing. It was about survival. Ethan understood now that the meeting ritual was not a simple exchange. It was a test of his mind and spirit, a trial that would determine if he was strong enough to be part of their world. The question was, would he survive it? Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he continued to stand at the center of the ritual circle, surrounded by the Jiren women. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions and experiences that weren't his own. Each connection, each exchange with these aliens was overwhelming. He had thought he could handle it, but the more they shared, the more difficult it became to distinguish his own thoughts from theirs. Their memories and feelings were blending with his, and it was becoming harder to stay grounded. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in his mind, but it didn't help. The glow in the room intensified, and the air seemed to hum louder. It was as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on him, filling him with an energy that he couldn't escape. The Jiren were still there, their eyes locked on him, each one taking their turn to add to the growing connection. Clyra stepped forward once more, her tall figure towering over him. Her violet eyes were filled with a depth of understanding that sent a shiver down his spine. She reached out, her hand hovering near his shoulder, and for the first time, Ethan felt a deep, almost comforting warmth from her. "Do you still wish to continue, human?" Clyra asked, her voice softer now, as though she sensed his growing discomfort. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can handle more. It's so much." The older Jiren woman, who had connected with him first, tilted her head slightly. "It is natural to feel overwhelmed. The bond we share is not one that should be taken lightly. But if you wish to truly understand us, you must endure. There is much more to learn, and much more that you need to understand about us." He nodded slowly. It wasn't that he didn't want to continue. It was just that the ritual was far more intense than he had imagined. He hadn't expected to feel so exposed, so vulnerable. The Jiren weren't just sharing memories. They were sharing their essence, their very souls. "Are you ready?" Clyra's voice was firm, yet somehow kind, as though she was giving him one last chance to back out. Ethan hesitated, but the thought of failing his mission, of being cast out by the Jiren, was too much. He had come so far, and he knew that this ritual was his only opportunity to prove that he was worthy of their trust. There was no turning back now. "I'll do it," Ethan said with more determination than he felt. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he had no choice. He had to see this through. Clyra nodded, and the women around him began to move once again. This time, however, the connection felt different. The energy in the room seemed to shift, and the air became thick with a quiet intensity. It wasn't just their minds that were connecting now. It felt as though their very spirits were intertwined. As the next Jiren woman approached, Ethan braced himself for the rush of memories that would come. But this time, something unexpected happened. Instead of being overwhelmed by the flood of emotions, he found himself more focused. It was as if the connections were becoming clearer, more defined. The Jiren woman's thoughts, her experiences, her hopes, merged with his own. But now, instead of feeling lost, Ethan felt a sense of understanding. He could feel her strength, her resolve. He could sense the deep connection she shared with the others in the circle. The memories came slowly this time. He saw glimpses of her childhood, the long journey she had taken to become a leader among the Jiren. He felt her pride in their accomplishments, but also the burden of responsibility that weighed heavily on her. There was joy, but also a deep sadness in her eyes, a loss she had never fully healed from. Ethan took a deep breath, allowing the memory to wash over him. He felt his own emotions stirring, a mixture of empathy and respect. These were becoming easier. It wasn't that he was growing numb to the intensity of the experience, but rather he was learning to control it. He could still feel their memories, their emotions, but he was no longer overwhelmed by them. Instead, he was learning to navigate the flood of thoughts with clarity, to see things from their perspective. And as he connected with each new Jiren woman, he began to realize something that he hadn't fully understood before. The meeting ritual wasn't just about learning their customs. It was about building trust, about understanding each other on a level that transcended words. It was about creating a bond, one that could never be broken, and one that would change him forever. By the time the ritual came to a close, Ethan felt exhausted, yet more connected to the Jiren than he had ever imagined possible. His mind was filled with their memories, their lives, and yet he still felt like himself. He hadn't lost who he was. Instead, he had gained something valuable. Clyra stepped forward, her eyes glowing with quiet approval. "You have done well, human," she said. "You have shown strength, and you have shown humility. You have proven that you are worthy of our trust." Ethan's chest swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. He had done it. He had passed the ritual. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The Jiren had allowed him to see their world, to understand their culture in ways he never could have imagined. And now he was a part of that world. The ritual was over, but the echoes of the experience lingered in Ethan's mind. Ethan followed her as she led him out of the room. They walked through winding corridors that seemed to pulse with life. It wasn't just the walls or the plants that thrived in this space. There was a sense that the entire city, the very air itself, was alive. It was beautiful, but also humbling. Ethan felt like a visitor in a place where he didn't belong. As they walked, the Jiren woman explained more about their society. "Our people are deeply connected to the world around us. We do not simply live in our cities. We live with them. Every structure, every building, every object has a purpose and a meaning. Our world is our home, and we treat it with respect." Ethan listened intently, feeling as though he was only beginning to understand the philosophy that guided the Jiren way of life. The gathering took place in an open space, a large area surrounded by plants and flowers that seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. The Jiren women gathered in small groups, talking, laughing, and exchanging ideas. The air felt lighter here, less intense than in the ritual chamber, and the voices were filled with a warmth that made Ethan feel more at home than he had ever felt on this foreign planet. Clyra stood beside him, observing the women as they spoke to one another. "This is how we communicate, human," she said, her voice gentle. "Not just through words, but through understanding, through our actions, and the energy we share." Ethan watched as two women stood at the center of the group, moving together in a synchronized dance. It wasn't a formal performance, but rather a spontaneous expression of unity. Their movements were graceful, fluid, as though they had practiced it for years, but Ethan could sense that it wasn't rehearsed at all. It was simply an expression of how they felt in the moment, a way of showing their shared connection to each other and to the world around them. "This is how we bond," Clyra explained, "not just through conversation, but through physical connection, through shared movements. Our dances are a reflection of our unity." Ethan couldn't help but be amazed by the way the Jiren interacted with each other. It was so different from human society, where relationships were often based on words and promises. Here, everything seemed to flow naturally, in harmony with the surroundings. It was a subtle, almost magical sense of togetherness that Ethan had never experienced before. He observed closely as the women shared their stories and ideas, speaking not just with their words, but through their expressions, their movements, and the energy that passed between them. It wasn't about the literal meanings of what was said. It was about the unspoken connection that could only be understood through experience. "You see," Clyra said, noticing Ethan's thoughtful expression, "our communication is not bound by the limitations of words. Our connection is deeper, more instinctual. We don't need to explain ourselves constantly because we understand each other on a more primal level. That's why it's so important to be in tune with those around you, to understand the flow of energy and how it connects us all." Ethan nodded slowly, trying to process what she had just said. He was used to verbal communication, to explaining himself, to convincing others through the power of language. But here, words were secondary to the deeper, more intuitive connections they shared. It was both freeing and challenging at the same time. "Are you ready to join?" Clyra asked, breaking his train of thought. Ethan blinked in surprise. "Join in? You mean dance?" "Not just dance," she replied with a smile. "Join in the connection. It's not about following steps or rhythms. It's about feeling the energy and moving with it. Moving with us." Ethan hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure if he was ready to try something so spontaneous. But then he thought of all the ways the Jiren had welcomed him, all the ways they had shown him their world. They had trusted him, and now it was his turn to trust them. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice a bit uncertain but filled with determination. Clyra smiled encouragingly. "Good. Just follow the flow of the energy." As the women continued their movement, Ethan stepped into the center of the group. At first, he felt awkward. He wasn't sure how to move, how to follow their lead. But the longer he stayed there, the more he began to feel the rhythm of the energy around him. It wasn't a physical rhythm. It was something more subtle, something that resonated deep within him. He began to feel the warmth of the Jiren women's connection, their unspoken unity, and slowly, almost instinctively, he began to move with them. At first, his movements were stiff, unsure. But gradually, as the energy of the group wrapped around him, his body began to flow in time with theirs. It wasn't just about movement. It was about connecting to the pulse of the group, the rhythm of life itself. Ethan began to understand what Clyra had meant when she spoke about feeling the connection. He wasn't just dancing with the Jiren. He was becoming a part of something much larger. The energy around him became his guide, and he began to trust it. After a few moments, the dance seemed to come naturally. His movements became smoother, more fluid, as though he had been doing this all his life. And with each step, each gesture, he felt himself growing closer to the Jiren. He wasn't an outsider anymore. He was part of their world, part of their connection. When the dance finally came to an end, Ethan's breath was heavy, and his heart was pounding. But he felt something that he hadn't felt before, a sense of belonging, a sense of peace. The energy that had once overwhelmed him now felt like a part of him, like a bridge between himself and the Jiren. Clyra looked at him with a proud smile. "You have done well, human. You have truly embraced our way." Ethan smiled back, feeling a sense of pride swell within him. "I never thought I'd experience something like that." It was incredible. "It is only the beginning," she said softly. "There is much more to discover, much more to learn. But for now, you have shown that you are beginning to understand us." Ethan nodded, his heart filled with gratitude. He wasn't just learning about the Jiren anymore. He was becoming part of their world. And for the first time, he felt that he truly belonged. Ethan had come a long way since his arrival on the Jiren homeworld. What had begun as a confusing, strange experience, full of uncertainty and fear, had now blossomed into something much deeper, something that felt more like a calling than an obligation. Each passing day, he grew more connected to the Jiren, more immersed in their ways, their culture, and their understanding of the universe. But despite all that he had learned, there was still so much left to discover. That morning, as Ethan stood on a balcony overlooking the vast Jiren city, he felt the weight of all that had transpired. The towering structures, made of living stone, rose from the earth like ancient trees. The plants, alive with vibrant colors, wrapped around the buildings, creating a seamless fusion of nature and architecture. It was a world unlike anything he had ever seen, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of awe as he gazed out at the endless expanse before him. Behind him, Clyra stepped up to join him, her presence quiet but commanding as always. "You've come far," she said, her voice carrying a note of pride. "Farther than I had expected, even." Ethan turned to her, meeting her gaze. "I never imagined I would be here, living this life. It feels different, but in a good way." Clyra smiled softly. Good. It is our hope that you will continue to grow, to understand not only us but yourself as well. In many ways, this world has been a mirror to you, reflecting parts of yourself you may not have known existed. Ethan thought about her words for a moment. There was truth in what she said. He had arrived on the Jurin homeworld as a stranger, someone who had been convicted and forced into this strange new world. He had resisted at first, unsure and uncomfortable in his new role. But now, it felt as if he had shed those old feelings, like a snake shedding its skin. He was no longer an outsider. He was part of something bigger. He was beginning to understand the Jurin, not just in terms of their customs and rituals, but as beings who shared the same fundamental need for connection, for harmony. I still have a lot to learn, Ethan said, his voice thoughtful. I know I'm not fully there yet, but I feel like I'm on the right path. You are, Clyra agreed. The path you walk is your own, but it will always be intertwined with ours. As long as you are willing to grow, to keep learning, there is no limit to what you can achieve. Before Ethan could respond, Clyra raised a hand, signaling to one of the other women nearby. The woman approached, a soft smile on her face, and presented Ethan with a small, intricate object. It was a sphere made of delicate silver-like material, glowing softly in the morning light. This, Clyra explained, is a symbol of your journey. It represents not just your connection to the Jurin, but also your commitment to the path of understanding. Keep it with you, and whenever you feel lost or unsure, let it remind you of how far you've come. Ethan took the sphere carefully, feeling its weight in his palm. It was cool to the touch, smooth, yet somehow alive with energy. He knew, in that moment, that this was more than just a token. It was a reminder of everything he had learned and everything he still had yet to understand. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. I won't forget this. Clyra nodded, her expression serious but warm. Remember, Ethan, the journey never truly ends. There will always be more to discover. And in return, you will continue to share your own experiences, your own understanding, with us. We are connected now, more than just by this moment. You have become part of our world, just as we have become part of yours. As Clyra turned and began to walk away, Ethan stood for a moment longer, gazing out at the world before him. The horizon stretched far, a sea of possibilities and experiences waiting for him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of it. He had found a place here, among the Jurin, and with them, he had found a new way of thinking, of living, of being. That afternoon, Ethan met with the other Jurin women, who had become his teachers and companions over the past few weeks. Together, they walked through the city, discussing their history, their philosophies, and the unique ways they had learned to live in harmony with their environment. It was clear that the Jurin weren't just a species, they were a living example of balance and unity, and they saw no separation between themselves and the world around them. Their teachings were simple, yet profound. They emphasized the importance of listening, really listening, to everything, to the wind, the earth, and even the unspoken words between individuals. They taught him that every being, every object, had its own unique energy, and that true understanding came from recognizing and respecting that energy. As they walked, one of the women, a younger Jurin named Lyra, looked at Ethan and asked, "Do you understand why we value these connections so much?" Ethan thought for a moment, recalling everything he had learned over the past few weeks. "I think so," he said slowly. "It's because everything is connected. Not just people, but everything. The plants, the animals, the land itself. You believe that we all share the same life force, and by connecting with it, we can understand the universe better." Lyra smiled brightly. "Exactly. You are beginning to understand. Our culture, our way of life, is all about harmony. We believe that when you understand the interconnectedness of all things, you become part of something greater. And that is the ultimate goal, to live in a way that respects all life, all energy. Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him as Lyra spoke. He had begun this journey unsure of himself, and now, it seemed, he had found his place. The Jiren had opened his eyes to a way of thinking that transcended everything he had ever known. And in doing so, they had not only taught him about their world, but about his own. As the day came to a close, Ethan stood once again on the balcony, the sphere in his hand glowing softly in the twilight. He was no longer the same man who had arrived on the Jiren world. The journey he had taken, the lessons he had learned, had changed him, and as he looked out at the stars, he realized that his journey was far from over. There was still much to learn, much to experience. But now he knew he wasn't alone in this vast, unknown universe. He was part of something greater, a part of the Jiren world. And that was just the beginning. The gathering took place in an open space, a large area surrounded by plants and flowers that seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. The Jiren women gathered in small groups, talking, laughing, and exchanging ideas. The air felt lighter here, less intense than in the ritual chamber, and the voices were filled with a warmth that made Ethan feel more at home than he had ever felt on this foreign planet. Clyra stood beside him, observing the women as they spoke to one another. "This is how we communicate, human," she said, her voice gentle. "Not just through words, but through understanding, through our actions, and the energy we share." Ethan watched as two women stood at the center of the group, moving together in a synchronized dance. It wasn't a formal performance, but rather a spontaneous expression of unity. Their movements were graceful, fluid, as though they had practiced it for years, but Ethan could sense that it wasn't rehearsed at all. It was simply an expression of how they felt in the moment, a way of showing their shared connection to each other and to the world around them. "This is how we bond," Clyra explained, "not just through conversation, but through physical connection, through shared movements. Our dances are a reflection of our unity." Ethan couldn't help but be amazed by the way the Jiren interacted with each other. It was so different from human society, where relationships were often based on words and promises. Here, everything seemed to flow naturally, in harmony with the surroundings. It was a subtle, almost magical sense of togetherness that Ethan had never experienced before. He observed closely as the women shared their stories and ideas, speaking not just with their words, but through their expressions, their movements, and the energy that passed between them. It wasn't about the literal meanings of what was said. It was about the unspoken connection that could only be understood through experience. "You see," Clyra said, noticing Ethan's thoughtful expression, "our communication is not bound by the limitations of words. Our connection is deeper, more instinctual. We don't need to explain ourselves constantly because we understand each other on a more primal level. That's why it's so important to be in tune with those around you, to understand the flow of energy and how it connects us all." Ethan nodded slowly, trying to process what she had just said. He was used to verbal communication, to explaining himself, to convincing others through the power of language. But here, words were secondary to the deeper, more intuitive connections they shared. It was both freeing and challenging at the same time. "Are you ready to join?" Clyra asked, breaking his train of thought. Ethan blinked in surprise. "Join in? You mean dance?" "Not just dance," she replied with a smile. "Join in the connection. It's not about following steps or rhythms. It's about feeling the energy and moving with it. Moving with us." Ethan hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure if he was ready to try something so spontaneous. But then he thought of all the ways the Jiren had welcomed him, all the ways they had shown him their world. They had trusted him, and now it was his turn to trust them. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice a bit uncertain but filled with determination. Clyra smiled encouragingly. "Good. Just follow the flow of the energy." As the women continued their movement, Ethan stepped into the center of the group. At first, he felt awkward. He wasn't sure how to move, how to follow their lead. But the longer he stayed there, the more he began to feel the rhythm of the energy around him. It wasn't a physical rhythm. It was something more subtle, something that resonated deep within him. He began to feel the warmth of the Jurin women's connection, their unspoken unity, and slowly, almost instinctively, he began to move with them. At first, his movements were stiff, unsure. But gradually, as the energy of the group wrapped around him, his body began to flow in time with theirs. It wasn't just about movement. It was about connecting to the pulse of the group, the rhythm of life itself. Ethan began to understand what Clara had meant when she spoke about feeling the connection. He wasn't just dancing with the Jurin. He was becoming a part of something much larger. The energy around him became his guide, and he began to trust it.